Okay, do I have your permission to record?
Yes.
Okay, on the phone with us now is Professor Don Livingston out of South Carolina. He is a professor of philosophy and he received his degree at Emory University, but he also teaches at many other
No,
universities.
no, it's not, no,
I'm
no,
sorry.
no, no. Sorry, sorry.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
No,
No,
please.
I didn't receive my.
Okay.
No. Okay, I am a retired professor of philosophy from Emory University,
Yeah,
and
just
I didn't get.
okay. What other credentials do you have, Professor? So it's said exactly the right way.
um, I'm a retired professor of philosophy at Emory University,
You also
or
had
professor of philosophy at Emory University, retired, however you want to put it.
okay, and you had something to do with the University of Edinburgh.
Yes. I was twice a fellow. You can just say, if you want to, he is a sometime fellow. Sometime fellow. I've been there twice. Asked to come twice. Sometime fellow of the Institute for Advanced Studies in the Humanities at the University of Edinburgh.
And there was also some international organization you were somehow tied to. Is that fair?
uh, I won. I received a um, National Endowment Independent Study Fellowship
Okay. Okay.
from the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Okay. And Professor,
That's
you.
all. Good.
No, I'm sorry. Please go. Please go ahead.
No, no. That's just, I was going to joke something.
Uh, uh, Bottom line, you're a professor. You have a degree in philosophy. You're well studied. You traveled. You've seen independence movements, and you've studied them for better than maybe 15 years. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah. Yes. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Okay. Okay. So, could you tell the readers, just so they have some background on you, how did you get into this line of study? What inspired you to study it? When did you start, and what got you in it?
Well, when the Soviet Union collapsed, people were confused and didn't quite understand it. And I began to I noticed that it was peaceful. The 15 states seceded from what was the most centralized regime probably in history, and that was a remarkable thing. So I began to look at the topic, and one thing I found is that when I looked at the Philosopher's Index, um, on, which publishes all articles in philosophy in 5 languages since 1940, there were only 7 articles with the word secession in the titles.
Huh.
Philosophers just didn't say anything about it. And 5 of those were book reviews of the only book in English by a philosopher that had come out in the early 90s entitled Secession from Fort Sumter to Lithuania.
Lithuania. Yeah, right. Right, by Buchanan.
And yeah, by Buchanan, James, not James, but Alan Buchanan. And other of the 7 articles were on Quebec, which had just narrowly voted not to secede from Canada. So this perked my interest, and I started studying, looking at the concept of secession. And what really fascinated me is that philosophers have said nothing about it. And philosophy is radically free thought, and it can inquire into anything, including itself. But somehow philosophers have not said anything of interest about this topic. So I had the market pretty much to myself, I think.
A blue ocean strategy, I think that's called, where there's no competitors in a market that's largely ignored.
Yeah, academics always like to have a market to themselves. Um,
Why is that? Why did no one cover this? You would think that the Soviet Union collapsing and peacefully would be worth study just out of interest, even if you don't like the idea of countries breaking off. Just an
Yes.
academic curiosity. Why a dearth of
I
coverage?
think the answer. I think the answer is pretty clear. It goes back to the 17th century. Historians will tell you that this thing called the modern state is formalized in Europe in the 17th century. There are intimations of it early, and often one mentions the Treaty of Westphalia. And the modern state is a unique thing. It's something that modern Europeans created. We use the word state to describe things prior to that. For example, we talk of the Greek city-states or the Egyptian state or the Roman state. And this is really misleading because there were certain resemblances, but those were not states as the modern state is understood. Weber put it rather nicely, I think. He said a modern state is a territorial monopoly over individuals in a territory. In other words, there's a central authority, there's a territory, and there are individuals in that territory. And the central government has a monopoly on coercion over them. In other words, you cannot have within that territory a competing jurisdiction.
Right, right.
Um, and so that is the modern state. Now, not all modern states absolutely meet that ideal, but that is what is intimated. So whenever you say the Pledge of Allegiance to one nation indivisible, what you're saying is there cannot possibly be any independent social authority within that
Hmm.
within that territory. In other words, if it were, then it could leave or have a legal corporate resistance to simple authority. And of course, we have a federal system that was founded by sovereign states, and they created the central government as a service agency for their well-being. But what they created was not a modern state. It was more like a medieval uh, entity formed by compacts. So, to answer your question, I'm wandering off a bit, I think, but to answer your question, the reason why philosophers hadn't thought about it is because this idea of the modern state took root, and it just spread throughout Europe. So every modern state is one and indivisible. If a modern state is one and indivisible, then there's nothing to think about. There's nothing to talk about because secession would be the separation of a modern state, and that is unthinkable.
Interesting.
So
Interesting.
it's tied into the philosophic notion of government as such. So all the great modern philosophers, Locke, Rousseau, Hobbes, and Mill, they all assume that the grid of political conduct is a modern state. And even the American regime, which was not a modern state, it was a medieval type federation of polities. The Middle Ages were full of these things. The Holy Roman Empire, Switzerland today is a federation of states. Um, um, anyway, those existed in modern times, but there was an attempt always to see them as really modern states, even though they actually on paper were not. And so America is a very good example of that.
And you're
Lincoln, sorry.
no, no, yeah, yeah. Just to summarize for everyone listening in, you are reviewing scholars going back hundreds of years. I think you're looking at Max Weber, Patrick Buchanan, Emil Durkheim, people who've written over the last couple of decades about what is the state. And I think you're suggesting that they've basically said or convinced the entire academic establishment in the Western world, done deal. No need to investigate this at all. It's a boring topic. Nothing can change. No research, this can't be modified. So there's no real reason to analyze this academically because it's a done deal. There's nothing to look at, then you can't go anywhere. Is that a fair summary?
Yes, that's right. There's nothing to think about.
Hmm.
Now, the Soviet Union shook that up a bit. and because then you had 15 states seceding from a centralized regime peacefully.
Right.
By the way, it's the largest peaceful democratic revolution in modern time,
Thank you.
arguably in any time when you think about it.
Right.
Um, so this began to change how people thought. Um, and so little by little, books began to appear on secession. I'll give you another example. I was asked to participate in a session on secession at the American Philosophical Association meeting.
Nice.
Um, and another fellow had been writing on it at Washington University. So we were invited to speak, and no one showed up. These were small sessions. They never had more than, let's say, 20 people. So the convention was broken up into lots and lots of sessions. But this I thought would be curious to people. But a friend of his showed up, and a friend of mine showed up. So we just went out and had a drink and didn't hold the session.
Okay.
And that's just that wouldn't happen now.
Right.
People would come to it.
Well, let's get into it. You've been studying for years, and you're a pretty good expert on this, who's done a lot of the classics reading to the subject. Has the topic of secession in the world, in the Western world, increased in curiosity? Are people talking about this a lot more than they were before? You'd be in a position to say that you've seen a growth, or same level of conversation they had 15, 20 years ago. Are we seeing an uptake in academic and general public curiosity?
Oh yes, all over the world.
Interesting.
And in Europe. Let's see. Well, as Quebec had a secession movement. We know about Scotland considered seceding from Britain, had a vote on it. Britain had actually seceded from the EU. Catalonia had a non-binding secession referendum. They voted to secede. Lombardy in Italy voted to secede. The Veneto in Italy voted to secede in non-binding resolutions. Those are just some examples. But there are all sorts of in Belgium. There are such movements. Coming to the United States, the country most hostile to secession because of the history of the war between the states and this one nation indivisible business, and this desire to have a nation,
right,
and it not be divisible. Even here, polls. I noticed in 2008, polls began to appear. There might have been some earlier, but in 2008, they began to appear asking people, do you think your state has a right to secede? Would you like it to secede? And such things. Those polls are conducted every year. Now, no one at the 10 years or so prior to that would have thought of having a poll on secession.
Interesting.
Here's a country where everybody said one nation indivisible. How are they going to be thinking about secession? That's dividing the union. But the polls are taken. So in 2008, 22% of Americans said they would like their states to secede. 10 years later, in 2018, 39% said they would like their states to secede, and 29% said they weren't sure. Well, that's 68% that are willing to think about it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's happened in the last 10 years. So that tells us something, I believe.
So what's going on? What's going on? Americans don't view themselves as like other countries. And yet here we see the same impulse organically from the grassroots in America, ground level up, as we do in Europe, as we do in Pacific Islands. Recently I did an interview with Bougainville out of near Australia. It seems like everybody in the Western world is thinking about secession, and that includes America. What is going on? Because Americans pride themselves on being different and out of tune than the rest of the world. What's everybody seeing? Why are they all thinking about this, and why now?
I don't know that I have an easy answer to that. Of course, there are a lot of people who are opposed to secession, as you know. It's not
Of course.
as a big bandwagon here, but what we have is a remarkable number of people who are willing to think about this
Yeah.
and advocate it openly. This is a stirring of something. We don't know what will come of it, but I think there's a profound discontent with the American regime. I mean, both sides, the two parties can't even talk with each other. They don't communicate. The media is completely politicized. It's really hard to find any balanced analysis of the news that's fact-based and that's skeptical about what's going on. I mean, you need skepticism among journalists to raise hard questions, that sort of thing. You just don't have it. And so if America is a nation, if the president was to get up and to say, my fellow Americans, as could be said, say in the 50s, people will resonate with that because America was fairly ethnically homogeneous, at least as far as a European stock people was concerned. There are very few Hispanics in 1960.
Right.
And it was mainly a white European and African country.
Right.
So there was a kind of Sorry.
No, I'm agreeing with you. I agree with everything you said.
Yeah. So you could say there was a sort of nation. See, there was no nation prior to the Civil War. It was a federation of states. Americans have a hard time understanding that. But America was more like the European Union than it was like France. Afterwards, the idea was to make America into something like France, one centralized regime. And that's been the effort ever since. And that's running out of gas. The demographic changes have upset the European ethnic identity of American nationalism. So you've got that tension. There's globalism. And so I think these forces, and I'm no one to have any special insight on this. What I'm saying is fairly obvious. You see it in Europe. But this contents, and people are looking for somewhere to go where they can find people like themselves to enjoy self-government.
So we're seeing an end of the arc, perhaps, of history. I believe it was the modern German state in the late 1800s started unifying, and Italy did it, and then they started developing bureaucracy. I believe the first bureaucratic office building was built in Germany. Then England and France, which were already unified, said, hey, I get that, a unified state, Social Security for everybody, things like that. But I think you're suggesting that perhaps this idea of, hey, you're better the more unified you get, starting in the late 1800s, is perhaps coming to an end, and people just around the world are thinking, maybe that's not the right vector.
Yeah, I think it's being questioned. It's being questioned. And first you have to question something, and then that changes your ideas, and then you start with policy. But you can't change policy until you change your mind.
Interesting.
And people are changing their minds about the modern state. They don't even know it because they don't even have the theory of the modern state. But that's what they're doing in their conduct. So I think you're right. If you look at Europe prior to say 1800, let's say 1700. I mean, it's made up of there are no nation states. I mean, it's made up of just lots of little countries.
Right.
I mean, Germany was a geographical description of 230 little principalities and free cities. That's deeply ingrained in people. They don't forget that sort of thing. You've lived for centuries that way in certain areas. That sort of stays with you. They're crushed. All of them are crushed by wars of centralization and unification. The American Civil War, the Soviet wars, the French Revolution, on and on and on. Bismarck's blood.
And Garibaldi.
exactly, and they're crushed into these big monstrous states. And then what do they do? The point of these states was to provide peace and stability and not have civil wars. Well, it cut down on the number of civil wars maybe within the state, but it generated global
Yep.
wars because these monsters were allergic to each other.
Yeah. Yes.
And so I think there's a disillusionment about all of that. And I think we're sort of stumbling around trying to find a human scale now to live. One thing I might say is philosophically, one way to look at this is that, not to get into this, I hope it won't be too arcane, but the great 17th century British philosopher Thomas Hobbes, he's the first theorist of the modern state. And he argues that this is the best form of polity. And in fact, it's the form of human salvation. It's the only way mankind can overcome misery. But the alternative to that is Aristotle. And Aristotle said that the state is a natural organic thing that grows and develops like a natural language. Nobody plans a natural language. It grows and develops, but it's a real thing. And so one way to look at the American Revolution is there were some people in Britain like Hume and Francis Hutcheson who said the colonies will eventually grow up and become real states. This is just inevitable, and the British should prepare for this. At the end of his masterpiece, An Inquiry into Moral Philosophy, he has a chapter titled, When It Is That Colonies May Become Independent. And the idea is that eventually they will become independent, just like a child will grow up and become a man.
Right.
Now, in the Hobbesian view, Hobbes assumes every man is an egoist, and you're going to have nothing but civil war unless you have a powerful will to crush these egoistic, self-willed individuals into a political society. And this is done by force. And once it's established, though, you have the possibility of peace and stability. So when you say the modern state is one and indivisible, what you're saying is there is a monopoly on coercion from the central government.
Right.
All of them have that. So there's a kind of ugly thing behind this. It's not organic. It's developed by force. Just like the American nation we have today was established by the Civil War. Lincoln destroyed the Federation of States and created a French-style unitary state with a policy of blood and iron, just like Bismarck did. So this was played out everywhere. But there are all sorts of reasons to do this. Human progress requires that you can't have progress without experts running the state and doing things right, and you can't leave it up to people, this, that, and the other. All that sounds fine. Well, we did it. It's only about 200 years old, this kind of system. And I think a lot of people now have state fatigue. They're beginning to question it.
Yeah, so just for everybody reading along, the books are The Leviathan by Thomas Hobbes, The Republic
Yes.
By Plato. I believe we also talked about Max Weber, and you're referring to the sociology study he did on the exclusive use of violence, determining a state. And
Yeah.
also Peasants into Frenchmen, which was the study of the creation of the French state, which was the model for unitary states throughout Europe and certainly copied by American President Lincoln.
Yes. Yes. Yes, he doesn't actually say that. He doesn't mention France, but in his Gettysburg Address, he lays out that sort of model.
Oh yeah, I don't want to debate Lincoln in the Civil War. That will be a long thing. I will point out that to back up that Lincoln was trying to create a modern state. A couple things. One, he was a lawyer for the railroads. Okay, that was his exclusive client. After the Civil War, the entire railway system went from two separate systems to a unified one system, which was key to the industrial age, which was the era he was living in. He was also very aware of that. He lived in the North, so he saw ships coming in from Europe. He saw international trade. He saw ships and iron and railways were the key to economic power. And the guy consolidated the railway and port complex throughout and after the Civil War. That happened. That has nothing to do with slavery. That was a unitary thing. But my favorite part was his letters to Bismarck, a German chancellor who was also unifying Germany and trying to make it a modern state in competition for international trade with England and France. His letters were very detailed. They routinely compared strategies about how do I get my backwoods country up to snuff so I can not be overruled by the English and the French. So clearly a unifying, modern, industrial, national strategy by Lincoln.
Yes. Yeah, this was everywhere. Yeah.
So let me ask you a couple hot topic questions. Given the background, do you think a state may secede from America in the next 15 years?
Well, I don't know. I can't say. There's a presumption against it in the sense that there's great power at the centers to resist it and so on. But I don't know. Right now, it'll take some time, and right now we don't have any real strong movement in that respect. California, you're involved in that. You would know better than I about how to answer that.
Well, one of the things that gives me encouragement is that there is a conservative majority in the Senate. It controls about 35 to 40 states. Demographics say that those 40 states are going to stay conservative till 2040, 2050. So it's not changing according to the U.S. Census for the next 2 to 3 decades. And a lot of those people, Pat Buchanan, Fox News commentators have said repeatedly, we don't like California, and if you wanted to go, you'll have the votes. Well, that's a majority vote in the Senate.
Yes. No, the signs are all over the place for secession in 15 years. I mean, the signs are there. I'm not saying that that's even probable. I'm just saying it's possible. It's thinkable.
Yeah.
Because of the divisions, people just can't communicate. The two parties can't communicate. The election was challenged. I mean, the Democrats don't think that they have a real president. The election is illegitimate. They'll think that the next time, most likely, if Trump wins. So you've really got a division now. But here's the problem. All that can go on, but unless people think, unless they think the states can secede, unless they believe that is a possibility. And I remember there was a time when I didn't think it was a possibility. I mean, I'd not really thought about it, but I was nervous even about thinking of the topic. Years ago, when I began to think about it, it was an unscalable cliff. And now polls are taken on it. So one thing that's happened is people are willing to talk about it. But their talk is awkward, it's uneducated, it's untutored, it's hesitant, but it's beginning. It's the beginning of the beginning, perhaps. I would say that after people start seriously talking about it and asking whether it would be better for the United States to divide peacefully and legally divide in some way, once they start talking about the merits of it and the problems involved in it, I think it could happen rather rapidly. That has to go on for some time.
Interesting. Wasn't it?
Let me give an example. Go ahead, sorry.
Oh, no, please.
I was going to say, shortly after the Soviet Union
collapsed. That's what I was thinking, the same thing. Yes, please tell them.
You know about the Vermont independence movement.
Oh, I thought you were going to talk about how only one of the governments that became a nation that was part of the USSR said, hey, we're going to secede and the Union may break up. And everybody laughed at them, and then 2 years later that happened.
Yeah, Lithuania.
Yes.
Yeah.
that Lithuania
Yeah.
was saying, watch out, this could happen, we're going to break up, we're going to do our own thing. Everybody at the UN and the Western world and the USSR and the EU and everybody laughed and laughed, and they were all dead wrong, and Lithuania was completely correct. And it happened in 2 years.
Yeah.
So
That's right.
change can happen rapidly when all of the experts say it'll never happen, right? I mean, we saw that.
Yes, yes, it can, and especially if there's some economic downturn or something that might spark it. But and there was that sort of thing in Russia. They were in bad shape economically, so there wasn't much authority there to discipline Lithuania. But I was going to mention what happened in Vermont. For some reason, the state of Vermont got it into its head to, I don't know how they're persuaded to do it, but they have town hall meetings on whether Vermont would be better off out of the Union than in it. They were not for secession, but would we be better off out of the Union than in it? They started thinking about that after the Soviet Union collapsed. They wouldn't have thought about it before. So here's an event that changed how they thought. They weren't for secession, but they wanted to think about this. So they had about 8 or 10 of these town hall meetings. I went to one of them later on, but and they raised the hard question: what about my Social Security? What about defense? And on and on. And they all voted that Vermont would be better off out of the Union. A political scientist, Brian, senior movement. He took the pro side, and some federal judge, whose name I can't remember, took the other side. And out of that came a secession movement in Vermont, founded by Thomas Naylor, called the Second Vermont Republic. And that movement started educating people about Vermont independence. That Vermont had been an independent state outside the Union until 1791, I think it was.
Yeah.
And they never joined the Union. They were like Texas.
A couple of years.
Well, yeah. Anyway, they had secession conferences at the State House. They got national, international attention, and they even ran a candidate for governor and some state legislative positions. Thomas Naylor died of a heart attack unexpectedly, and that sort of killed the movement. But it was going on quite well.
Huh.
And but the reason I mentioned it is that Vermonters just raised the question at one point, and then things start happening. You have to raise the question. It has to be thinkable. But see, people have said the Pledge of Allegiance. If you say that from childhood up, that gets into the central nervous system.
Yeah.
It's pretty deeply ingrained, and you can't easily get over it. But the polls I mentioned to you a little while ago, that where people say that, well, 39% say they do favor secession.
Yeah. So let me ask you. Recently got to talk to F.H. Buckley, professor. I think you know him out of George Mason University. Very, very brilliant man. He has a book out now where he is suggesting that America's too big.
Yes.
It might work better if we started letting units break off. And he's outright suggesting that, conservatives may want an America without a California and may function better. But what grabbed me was he said, whoa. Breaking off is too much, too radical. He is suggesting that there's an amendment that would allow California to have Quebec policy freedom. So you still stay here. We keep your image on the map. Everybody gets to act like it's the same. But California, instead of constantly arguing with the federal government and suing, you get to do your own thing. And we have the appearance of America together, so we don't have to go over those political hurdles. But you'd be able to have some policy freedom like Quebec, and that should cut down on the infighting in the federal government. What do you think about that, Professor? Feelings?
I think you would have to look at it in detail. I've read the book. In fact, I read the manuscript before it was published. Um, I think it's a very good idea. I think we have to begin with the way people are. It's going to be hard to go cold turkey. There's just too many uncertainties people will have about that. So it seems to me that the best policy, if you're really interested in gaining more independence, not only California but any other state or region, would be some sort of home rule, some sort of way to, as the British do, muddle through gradually. See, for example, Scotland.
Yeah.
I remember in the 70s, the Scottish students. I was over there in '75. Scottish students got up on the Calton Hill there in Edinburgh, and they had a vigil, and they said they wouldn't leave till they got a parliament. Now, the Scottish Independence Party had been around since the 30s. There's always been a Scottish Independence Party. I didn't, nothing came of it much, but it was always there. It had candidates, there were a few seats here and there. And eventually those students got their parliament. And the parliament was, to be just self-governing and so on. Nobody talked about secession. They just had their parliament. Then the parliament started talking about secession. And there was a movement. And then there was a vote, and Scotland almost seceded. So these things have to be taken step by step. And I think that home rule policy, which has worked well in the British Commonwealth, is a sensible idea.
Interesting. I remind people that before Scotland, part of the reason that Scotland wasn't able to have a majority vote for full secession was that many Scots had said, hey, we had this vote for devolution 10 years earlier, and it's working out pretty great. I kind of like that Scotland gets to do things on her own, maybe not all the policies, but they were able to give a lot of policy freedom, basically like Quebec. And many Scots enjoyed that and didn't want to give it up. So it seems like Quebec-style governance worked in both Canada and England, and a lot of people liked it.
Yes, and the thing about that is that let's suppose you had that in California.
Okay.
Then everybody would think of California differently. It would not. Let's put it this way. Lincoln described the states as counties. See, he denied they were sovereign political societies. Because if he says that, then the Constitution is a compact and there can be secession. So he said they're counties, he compared them to counties. Now, that's pretty much how Americans think about states. Not entirely, but that's part of the way they think. So California's a kind of county. There's electoral college and it has so many votes and this and that and the other. But if it has its own laws, if it has its own rules, then it's not a county anymore. It's its own kind of culture, like Quebec. Nobody thinks of Quebec as a county in Canada.
Yeah,
it's a real thing. It might bite you or something. So California will flow up differently. The Californians will think of themselves differently, and the rest of the nation will think of them differently. So there'll be all sorts of talk going back and forth about how this new thing works. This will strengthen California identity as a civic body, and also strengthen the identity of the other regions. And this will work, fine. But at some point, it might be that a division would be a good thing for everybody, and California would be prepared to do it. Whereas if California just stays as a county, as it were, it's going to be hard to get out of that.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the county can't leave.
Yeah.
The state, even you wouldn't think a county of California could secede. I don't know what you think, but I'll imagine that you might think, well, a county of California is not the sort of thing that can secede on its own. It might ask permission to secede, but it can't do it on its own. It's not a self-governing thing. It's an artifact of the legislature.
Thank you. Yes, the counties don't technically exist.
So we look at California as an artifact of the national will that created the Constitution. That's how Lincoln sees it.
Right.
So you got to break that way of thinking.
Right. One of the things that I've noticed in the last 2 years is that many people in California became aware of the air quality rule that California has since the 60s, I think about
Yeah.
50, 60 years. And, this was going on for 50 years. People here who at higher levels knew about it, most of the public didn't know about it or what it was. But basically, it was a law that said California can do its own air quality rules independent from the federal government and doesn't have to listen to them. And it's the only part in all of America that can do that. So it had this unique, what I believe is called, it had this unique Quebec-style policy freedom just on air quality for decades.
Yeah.
And Californians have loved it, and they didn't notice it was there until it was being threatened to being taken away. Additionally, on the American side, a lot of Americans were shocked to hear that actually the federal government gave California this unique freedom that no one else in America gets to have. And so we've seen some sort of Quebec-level policy freedom here given to California by America. And it was so unnoteworthy and undivisive and didn't really, throw a monkey wrench in the operating of the national system. No one noticed that it was there and how unique and powerful it was for 55 years. So why can't we do more of that?
Yes. Well, one reason we can't, it's hard to do is, and this is one of the good things about monarchies. Monarchies, as bad as it might be, do recognize, at least the British monarchy, and many of us do, recognize the peoples they govern as people. So Queen Victoria would be queen of the Scots and the Irish and the English and the dominions beyond the seas and all of this. And this sounds like she's boasting about all this power she has. Well, she is. But on the other hand, she's recognizing the reality of these political entities. She doesn't think of them as counties in a unitary state. You see? The Scots are real people. She's queen of the Scots. Well, take the Duke of Edinburgh. The Duke of Edinburgh gives Edinburgh a certain status. There's no Duke of Glasgow. Glasgow's a commercial center. It has no dignity. But Edinburgh does. The Duke of Edinburgh is the Prince of Wales. So the American states are just states, and they're counties, so to speak. So any way in which you can begin to assert an identity, a regional identity that can beat to its own drum and have these special privileges. And by the way, monarchs can get special privileges. But the British monarch, George III, and the other monarch, they had different deals with different colonies.
Right.
And some colonies, had privileges that others didn't have.
Good point. Good point.
You see, and so, but now it's got to be the same. We're a big monstrous continental republic, so to speak, and we've got to be equal. California can't have anything we can't have. You see, so one reason why Canada has more independence in that respect, both for its provinces and secession, and as you know, it has the right of even nullification in civil rights. Any province can nullify in civil rights. It's because of its monarchical tradition.
Yeah. So just to, again, for anybody listening in, if you want to Google the governments of Australia, England, Canada, India, and Brazil, and they all have the term is called, in sociology, asymmetrical federalism, meaning all those cool things that nobody else really gets. And I like to bring that up to point out there's a lot of democracies that are stable democracies, and they've done this, and their government did not collapse, and people didn't riot in the streets. It's okay. Life went on. So it seems like this is doable and doesn't automatically result in riots. I mean, we got 5 well-established democracies doing this for decades with no problems.
Yeah. Well,
Okay.
you just have to have the political will has to be there. We have to break out. You have to break out of the two-party system. The two-party system is a system for a national regime, whereas what you're talking about is asymmetrical relations, special relations, and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And we already have that happening now with the red and blue states, red and blue counties. In other words, we're talking now territorially.
Yeah.
In other words, when you say there are red states and blue states and red counties and so on, red cities and blue cities, you're speaking territorially. That's not how we used to speak. Everything's national, and the
Ah,
states are just counties. States aren't territories; they're just administrative units.
yeah. Okay.
But now we're saying these are territories. In other words, they have quasi-political status even now, as shady as it is. So there has to be a new kind of political discourse to do what you're talking about.
Well, that's all the time right now. But Professor, before I go, how can people get a hold of you? What's a website you'd like for them to go and check out, and what's a good way to continue the conversation with you, Professor?
Well, I don't have any website particularly regarding secession. I'm president of the Abbeville Institute, which is an institute that studies what's true and valuable in the Southern tradition, and of course the South is known for having seceded. And so we do think a lot about that. That's not the only thing we do, but that's one place where there are some things written about it. But as far as secession goes, I'm writing a book on it, and I have to get it finished so people can read it.
Well, you heard it here, Professor Donald Livingston, an expert on the topic for decades here in America. Professor, thank you. I will send you a copy of this real soon, tomorrow.
Good. Thank you very much.
Okay, bye bye.